Alan Newcastle sits alone watching YouTube videos on his computer when suddenly he hears an all-too-familiar cry for help.
There is no expectation of privacy in public.
There's no need to fear. Hezokuai is here.
When beginning the discussion of ID refusal, the easiest argument to debunk is the idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The argument being that traveling, as they will always make that fundamentally absurd distinction from driving, is in and of itself an expression of liberty and pursuing happiness. So let's take a look at the first idea, the pursuit of happiness. If, and it is absolutely not, as I will explain in a moment, if that were the law, then where do we draw the line? If a kiddie diddler, for example, finds happiness in diddling kids, does that mean that laws against such actions are a violation of his right to pursue happiness? Now, I suppose one would take that idea and run with it in the direction of, well, such a case that would include injury or harm to the child. To which I've seen, unfortunately, a diddler actually make the claim that because sex is fun and an expression of love, how is there injury or harm to someone when you're just showing them love through pleasure? But even that insane argument becomes implicitly irrelevant because of my next point. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness comes from the Declaration of Independence, not the Constitution, and therefore is not law. The next, somewhat more relevant, yet no less incorrect, is the argument from the Fourth Amendment. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly described by the place being searched and the persons and things being seized. The argument there being, of course, that asking for an ID is a seizure of the ID. This is redefining seizure to fit a false narrative. An officer looking at your ID is not the same as having it seized from you. But even if it were, let's take that argument and say it is indeed a form of seizure. The key phrase in the law is unreasonable. One of the arguments I often hear from those who oppose rational thought is that because every time a cop asks for an ID, someone just hands it over. It has become compulsory behavior to do so and is in essence a deprivation of rights. Another argument I've heard many times is that a cop asking for ID is just the officer trying to bait you into inadvertently admitting to some other non-related crime. This is where the logic of their misuse of the Fifth Amendment comes from. As the Fifth Amendment does allow you to remain silent, its purpose is to make it so the government cannot force you by law to say things that will incriminate you in a crime. So, from their point of view, the cop asking for ID is an attempt to trick you into giving up your Fifth Amendment right. And the last, or at least final one I'll address here, is that the whole thing is just a great big money-making extortion scheme. So let's break these down. First and foremost, the unreasonable search and seizure argument. Again, the key word is unreasonable. Now, the basic idea that what is or is not reasonable can indeed be subjective is a valid notion. So let's take a moment and think about the specific reasoning behind asking a driver or a traveler for an ID is truly, logically unreasonable to assume that if someone is behind the wheel of an automobile, that they'd have a license to operate such a large and dangerous machine? They will say they have the right to feel secure in their property. Who says it's your property? Without presenting any paperwork of who you are or who owns the property, who's to say it's indeed yours? Not to mention the abundance of arguments that the problem started with the stop itself, that the officer had no reason to pull over the car in the first place, and therefore all of the things I've been talking about become, in their mind, irrelevant because the stop should have never happened in the first place. The problem with such arguments, however, is that under even the smallest amount of scrutiny, it falls apart. When I dig, it is over 90% of the time simply the driver or traveler's opinion that the stop was unlawful. They'll say things like, well, I just had a broken tail light, or my tags were expired, or whatever the case may be. These things are reasons. You may not like the reason, but it is a reason, hence reasonable. The umbrage exhibited by the self-proclaimed defenders of the Constitution is manifest as a direct result of being asked to present their identification in and of itself. Let's take, for example, a situation that I've seen on YouTube, and I won't share the specifics as it's dash cam footage that clearly shows a person being killed, and not some made-up imaginary scenario, but a real-life example of how these sort of things do happen. A man was parked in a driveway, a private driveway, and his car was not the same one that's regularly parked in that location. So, right there, already, the argument from the other side, if it was correct, the officer should have just assumed that the man may be pulled over to take a nap and left him alone. But as the story unfolds, had the officer done that, a murderer would still be roaming the streets. But I'm jumping ahead. There are many reasons an officer should approach a vehicle in this situation. What if the driver pulled over because he was having a medical emergency? One could argue that he was not, but how does the cop know that if they do not investigate? Maybe the guy was lost and stopped to look for directions on his GPS. Great. But how does the cop know that if they don't investigate? In the opposition's worldview, the officer, thinking that perhaps the person is in danger and should try to help, that is indeed the case, is not suspicion of a crime and therefore none of the officer's business. So what? Let him die? Remember Uvalde? The Frauditors were all over the police for not running in to save lives. Yet, when an officer does run into a place to save a life, they're going to make the argument that a person's safety is not the police's concern. So what happens next? The officer approaches the car and asks the driver if he's okay. He says yes, he just needed some rest, so he pulled over to take a nap. So here we have a second time that according to their logical arguments, their illogical arguments, had the officer done what they say is their duty without violating rights, it would have led to a murderer getting away. The argument being, as soon as he said he was fine and just napping, the cop should have said, okay, have a good rest, have a nice day, and leave. The officer then committed the most abhorrent violation of civil rights an officer can ever possibly do. She asked for ID. At that moment, the man reached over, grabbed his gun, put it to the officer's chest, and pulled the trigger. The officer, however, was quick enough and aware of her surroundings enough to grab the muzzle and point it down. you.